If Officer Daniel Rodriguez hadn't decided to take that detour, he would have never spotted the dog. And if he hadn't spotted the dog, 23 children might still be trapped in darkness. It was one of those bitter December evenings in Riverside Falls, Montana, when twilight surrendered too early. The roads lay empty, the branches stood skeletal, and the scent of burning pine drifted through the air. Daniel had been patrolling these streets for almost 16 years. The type of officer who stayed calm under pressure and didn't rush to judgment. But that evening, something stirred his instincts before he understood what it was. He was stopped at a traffic light when he noticed it. A massive golden retriever, coat shimmering in the wind, positioned on the sidewalk, opposite a decrepit 3-story building. The structure appeared forgotten since the Reagan years. Glass panes fogged with dirt, roof tiles warped and broken, front steps crumbling like weary bones. But the dog wasn't simply wandering, it was watching. Apollo, the name Daniel would later give him, sat with perfect stillness, ears alert, dark eyes fixed on the building's entrance, as though expecting it to swing wide. No sniffing around, no fidgeting, just that steady, unwavering stare. Daniel lowered his window. "What's got you so interested, boy?" he called gently. The retriever didn't even flinch. The signal changed and Daniel continued on, convincing himself it meant nothing. Probably belonged to a neighbor, maybe watching for squirrels or just standing guard. But several blocks away, the image of that dog's intense focus kept gnawing at his thoughts. He recognized working dogs. He'd partnered with canine teams before, and this wasn't casual behavior. This was purpose. The following day, he deliberately chose the same route, and there Apollo was once more. Identical position, identical stance, eyes locked on that old building. Daniel pulled to the curb this time, stepping into the sharp cold. "Where's your family, buddy?" he asked, scanning the area. No leash, no tags, no owner visible. Apollo's head shifted slightly at Daniel's voice. Recognition. But then his gaze snapped back to the building. Daniel moved closer, and Apollo tensed, not from fear, but in caution, like "don't interfere." For a moment Daniel had the unsettling sense the dog understood something he didn't. 3 more days went by. On the 4th, Daniel found himself checking his watch, timing his patrol to pass that corner. Predictably, Apollo was there, motionless as stone. The building loomed behind him, siding peeling like burned skin, yard overrun with thorns, one window shutter hanging by a thread. Something about the scene troubled Daniel. He'd heard stories about the place over the years, teenagers daring each other to break in, tales of vagrants or odd sounds. But every time a unit investigated, they found nothing. Yet here was a dog who refused to look elsewhere. On the 5th day, the weather shifted. Icy rain lashed the streets, cutting sideways under an angry sky. Daniel assumed Apollo wouldn't brave it, but as he drove past, his wipers slicing the view into pieces, there he was, drenched, trembling, but anchored to the same spot. "That's enough." Daniel parked across the street, engine idling, and stepped into the downpour. "You'll catch pneumonia out here, pal," he muttered, crouching down. Apollo's eyes met his, and for the first time, the dog released a soft, plaintive whine. Then he looked back at the building. Daniel followed the stare again. The porch sagged under decades of neglect. The paint had vanished long ago, and the storm door hung askew. No movement, no noise, but the hair on Daniel's neck prickled. That evening, Daniel mentioned it at the station. A few officers joked about the phantom house mutt, but Lieutenant Garcia leaned forward, scowling. "That property's been a ghost town for ages. City's been trying to track down the owner, but they've vanished. You think something's happening inside?" "I think my gut's screaming it's not nothing," Daniel replied. Garcia shrugged. "You want to investigate, file for a warrant, you know the process." Daniel knew the process, but he also knew warrants for abandoned properties without solid evidence took forever. And time wasn't something he could waste, if something was wrong in there. 2 mornings later, Riverside Falls woke to a harsh frost that turned every surface into crystal. Daniel swung by the building again. This time, Apollo wasn't on the sidewalk. He was at the broken fence, front paws braced, tail rigid, a deep growl vibrating from his chest. Daniel exited the patrol car carefully. "What's wrong, boy?" Apollo barked once, sharp, urgent, then trotted up the fractured walkway toward the entrance. He stopped at the front door and scratched at it, claws tapping against the weathered wood, not the random pawing of a restless animal. This was intentional. Daniel glanced around the deserted street. You're really trying to communicate, aren't you? He thought about how animals sometimes guide people to discoveries no one else could make. That's why he loved stories like this. If you believe animals can be heroes in their own way, stay with me. You might want to follow Saved by Tales. You won't believe where this leads. Back in the cruiser, Daniel typed a quick message to Garcia. Need warrant for 247 Pine Avenue. Possible canine indication. He sent it before second-guessing himself. While waiting, he researched the property. County files, old newspaper articles. The building's taxes had gone unpaid for years. Last known owner, a shell corporation from out of state. That detail alone raised red flags. Without a warrant, watching was all he could do, and Apollo made sure he did exactly that. Day after day, rain or shine, the dog maintained his watch. One night, driving home, Daniel slowed as he approached Pine Avenue. His headlights swept across the building's sagging entrance. In that instant, he thought, no, he was certain. He caught movement behind a second-floor window. Just a flicker, a shadow shifting, then stillness. He braked, rolled down the window. The street was quiet, except for the engine's gentle rumble. Then from the shadows near the fence, two dark eyes caught the headlight beams. Apollo stepped into the light, wet from the mist, and barked once. It was the kind of bark that demanded action. The warrant arrived 4 days later. When Daniel parked in front of the building that morning, 2 patrol cars were already waiting. He stepped out to find Apollo by the fence, tail wagging slightly, as if to say, finally, let's see what you've been guarding, partner. Let's find out what you've been watching, buddy. Daniel murmured. The lock on the front door was weak, yielding to a twist of the pry bar. The air that escaped was stale and frigid, with an undertone of something disturbing. The floor groaned under their boots as they entered. The front room was empty. No furniture, no belongings, just crumbling wallpaper, and the musty smell of decay. Clear, Officer Martinez called from the kitchen. But Apollo wasn't interested in the kitchen. He'd already slipped into the corridor, nose down, tail stiff. He stopped at what appeared to be a storage door, then scratched at it. Daniel tried the handle. Locked. Hand me the crowbar, he said over his shoulder. Martinez passed it over, and with effort, Daniel forced the door open. Instead of shelves, a set of narrow wooden steps vanished into darkness. The air from below was colder, heavier. Apollo stepped forward, head lowered, sniffing the void. Then he descended without hesitation. Daniel clicked on his flashlight and followed. The beam swept across damp concrete walls. The basement was larger than expected, the ceiling low enough to force Daniel to stoop. Apollo padded ahead, his claws clicking on the floor. Halfway across, he stopped at another door, metal this time, secured from the outside. His tail was rigid, his ears forward, his body trembling with intensity. Daniel's stomach clenched. What the hell is this? Martinez caught up, shining his own light. This isn't up to code. None of this is. Daniel placed a hand on the bolt. It was stiff but gave way under pressure. The door creaked open, the sound reverberating in the cold darkness. Inside, the beam barely reached the far wall. Something moved in the shadows. Daniel took a step forward, and stopped. Daniel's flashlight sliced through the cold, stagnant air. His breath formed clouds in the frigid temperature. The moment the metal door swung open, it felt like the temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. Apollo stood in the doorway, muscles taut, head down. He didn't bark this time, just waited, his dark eyes shifting from Daniel to the darkness ahead. What is it, boy? Daniel whispered. The beam swept slowly across the space. The room beyond wasn't small, maybe 20 feet across, but it was nearly bare. Dust particles danced in the light, and somewhere distant, water dripped steadily. Martinez stepped in behind him, muttering, "Creepy as hell." They moved a few steps inside. The floor was concrete, cracked in several places. Rusted pipes ran along the walls. There was a faint smell, mouldy stale air, and something Daniel couldn't identify. Apollo moved toward the far wall, his claws tapping against the floor. He stopped at a section where the concrete looked different, darker, rougher. He sniffed along the seam, then pawed once. Daniel frowned. "Martinez, shine your light here." The beam revealed what Daniel had suspected. Another door. This one wasn't metal. It looked like thick weathered wood, reinforced with horizontal steel strips. It was also locked. Daniel knelt, running his fingers over the surface. There were scratches in the wood, some shallow, some deep. Not random marks. These were patterns, lines that looked like someone had dragged something sharp repeatedly over the same spots. Martinez shifted nervously. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Yeah," Daniel said, "but I hope we're wrong." The lock wasn't new. It was a heavy, old-fashioned padlock, the kind you didn't pick so much as break. Martinez handed over the crowbar, and Daniel wedged it under the shackle. It groaned, resisted, then snapped with a metallic shriek that echoed through the basement. He looked at Apollo. "Ready?" Apollo sat back on his haunches, tail rigid, eyes fixed on the door. When the door swung open, the smell hit them first. It was stronger now. Mildew, damp wood, and another layer beneath that made Daniel's skin crawl. He stepped inside slowly, sweeping his flashlight left to right. The beam caught rough stone walls, a low ceiling supported by wooden beams, and a corridor that extended deeper than expected. The sound of dripping water echoed strangely, as if the space were larger than it appeared. Apollo moved ahead, nose working frantically. He stopped at a corner and glanced back at Daniel. They followed him into a narrow hallway. The walls here were different, lined with plywood, as though someone had tried to conceal whatever was behind them. At the end of the hallway was another door, lighter wood this time, with a flimsy latch. Daniel hesitated, hand on the handle. Martinez looked at him. "We should call for backup." Daniel shook his head. "Let's see what we're dealing with first. If it's nothing, I don't want the whole department laughing at us for chasing shadows." Apollo gave a short, sharp bark. Daniel took that as his cue. The latch gave easily. The door opened inward with a long, low creak. His flashlight revealed a small room, 10 by 12 at most, empty except for a few broken chairs, and a rusted metal cot against the wall. The mattress was gone, but everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, except one chair, which had a faintly polished seat, as though someone had used it recently. Martinez stepped closer. "That dust pattern means somebody's been down here." Daniel scanned the corners. No footprints. They would have been obvious on the dusty concrete, which meant either someone had been very careful, or the dust had settled long after the room was used. Apollo sniffed the cot, then padded to the far wall, and started sniffing along the floor. Daniel followed, running his light over the baseboards. That's when he saw it. A thin line cut into the dust, curving toward the wall, as though something heavy had been dragged and propped against it. He crouched, pressing lightly against the wall. It flexed just enough to tell him it wasn't solid. "This isn't a foundation wall," he said. "What is it then?" Martinez asked. Daniel straightened, the unease in his gut deepening. Something someone built to hide something else. They spent the next 15 minutes checking every inch of the basement. Most of it seemed like standard neglected storage. Rusted shelves, broken tools, cracked paint cans. But the layout didn't make sense. The walls didn't match the footprint of the building above. Somewhere down here, there was more space. Apollo was the one who found it. He led them to a corner of the basement, where an old water heater stood cold and unused. The floor behind it was covered with plywood. Apollo sniffed, pawed once, and sat. Daniel and Martinez dragged the water heater aside, revealing a crude trapdoor cut into the concrete floor. Martinez let out a low whistle. "You've got to be kidding me." The trapdoor had no handle. They pried it open with the crowbar, and a rush of air, cold, damp, stale, hit them in the face. Daniel angled his flashlight downward. Narrow wooden stairs descended into complete darkness. The steps looked worn, edges rounded from use. He glanced at Martinez. "You armed?" Martinez patted his sidearm. Always. Daniel looked at Apollo. Stay close, buddy. And they descended. The stairs ended in another hallway, this one carved directly into packed earth. Wooden beams supported the ceiling, and faint mold crept along the edges. Daniel's flashlight caught glimpses of scuff marks on the ground, shoe prints, some small, some larger. The hallway ended at another door. This one was heavier, steel again, but newer than the rest. A thick bolt secured it from the outside. Daniel ran his hand over the bolt. It was slick with condensation. Apollo's ears were pricked forward, his nose pressed to the gap beneath the door. He gave a soft whine. Daniel's instincts flared. He'd been in situations like this before, serving warrants where things went wrong fast, but something about this was different. He could feel it in the cold air, in the absolute stillness of the space. Martinez looked at him, voice low. "We opening?" Daniel nodded once. He slid the bolt free, the metal squealing against the latch. The sound echoed down the hallway like a warning. When the door swung open, the darkness beyond was complete. He stepped inside, flashlight beam cutting through the black. The air was heavier here, the smell stronger. Damp concrete, stale sweat, and something faintly metallic. The beam caught shapes in the corner, small shapes. Martinez came in behind him, light sweeping wider. The shapes resolved into objects, bundles of fabric, a cracked plastic chair, a stack of dented metal trays. Apollo moved ahead, tail low, sniffing the air. Then he froze. Daniel followed his gaze toward the far end of the room. There was another door there, smaller, almost hidden in shadow. Unlike the others, this one was just plain wood, no visible lock. Something about it made the hair rise on Daniel's arms. Martinez's voice was barely above a whisper. "This is too much for just the two of us." Daniel didn't answer. He was listening. Somewhere behind that small door, faint but unmistakable, came a sound that didn't belong in an empty basement. It was quick, almost like a breath or a muffled sob. Apollo turned to look at Daniel, eyes wide, ears pricked. He gave a short, urgent whine. Daniel's voice was steady, but his pulse was racing. "Okay, buddy, let's see what's on the other side." He reached for the handle and froze. When the sound came again, clearer this time, a voice small, frightened. Daniel's fingers hovered over the small wooden door's handle. The voice, or whatever it was, had gone quiet again, swallowed by the thick, damp air of the underground space. Martinez's flashlight beam trembled slightly as it traced the edges of the door frame. "You heard that too, right?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah." Apollo stood frozen, his weight forward, ears trained on the door. His body language was clear. "This matters." Daniel's gut twisted. Years on the job had taught him to trust two things: his instincts and the instincts of a good dog. Right now both were telling him the same thing. He turned the handle slowly. The wood was worn smooth from use, and the latch clicked softly under his grip. The door pushed inward with only a faint creak, revealing another hallway. It was smaller than the others, narrow enough that Daniel's shoulders brushed the walls if he stood centered. The floor was dirt, uneven, with scattered footprints pressed deep into it. Some were small, too small for an adult. Martinez caught sight of them too. "Kids," he muttered. Daniel didn't answer, the thought lodging in his mind like a splinter. The air here was colder, heavier. Daniel's flashlight swept ahead, revealing a series of rough wooden partitions on either side of the hall. They weren't solid walls, more like crude stalls or cubicles. From somewhere farther down, a faint metallic clink echoed, followed by silence. Apollo moved forward, his breathing audible in the stillness. Every few steps he paused to sniff at the base of a partition before pressing on. They passed the first stall, empty, just a pile of old blankets in the corner, matted and dusty. The second stall had a single chair, with one leg broken clean off. The third, Daniel's light froze on it. On the wall, scratched into the wood, were Mark's tallies, maybe 20 or 30, grouped in uneven lines. Below them faint letters were carved into the wood, so rough they were barely readable. "Mom." Martinez let out a slow breath. What the hell happened down here? Daniel shook his head. Let's just keep moving. Halfway down the hall, the ground dipped slightly. The smell changed too. Less mildew. More of that metallic tang that made the back of Daniel's throat tighten. The hallway ended in another door. This one was different. Newer wood with a fresh coat of paint that looked almost out of place in the otherwise decayed basement. Apollo stopped in front of it, sitting back but never breaking his stare. Daniel crouched beside him. You've been leading us here the whole time, haven't you? Apollo gave a small quiet whine, then glanced up at the handle. Martinez stepped forward, his voice low. We don't have backup in place yet. We open this. We're committed. Daniel straightened. We've already crossed that line. He reached out, hands steady, despite the adrenaline buzzing in his veins, and turned the knob. The door opened into a larger room, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bulb flickered weakly, casting the space in a trembling yellow glow. Against the far wall stood 3 narrow beds, metal frames with thin stained mattresses. Beside them, a low table held a metal pitcher and a few cracked cups. On the floor, scattered toys lay abandoned. A small plastic truck missing its wheels, a faded stuffed rabbit, a jigsaw puzzle with pieces warped from dampness. The air was warmer here, but the warmth did nothing to ease the chill crawling up Daniel's spine. Then came the sound again, a quick intake of breath, like someone had been holding it for too long. Daniel's flashlight darted toward the corner of the room, where a curtain of rough fabric hung from the ceiling. He moved toward it slowly, each step deliberate. Apollo patted at his side, silent now. Daniel reached out, gripped the edge of the fabric, and pulled it back. Nothing, just another empty stall. A thin blanket folded neatly in the corner. Martinez exhaled in relief, but only for a second, because from somewhere behind them, a faint thud echoed. Both men spun, lights cutting across the room. Apollo was already moving, nose low, tracking the sound to a section of wall that looked wrong. The boards here were newer, nailed haphazardly, and a faint draft of warmer air seeped through the gaps. Daniel ran his hand along the boards, feeling for movement. One plank shifted under the pressure of his palm. Help me with this, he told Martinez. They pried the boards loose one by one until an opening emerged, small but big enough for a child to slip through. Daniel shone his light inside. The beam landed on a small space, barely bigger than a walk-in closet, and in that space, 2 wide eyes stared back at him. The child, maybe 8 years old, was crouched low, arms wrapped around their knees. Their hair was tangled, their clothes worn thin. For a moment they didn't move. Then their gaze flicked to Apollo, and something in their expression shifted. Apollo stepped forward, lowering himself so his head was level with the child. He gave the softest, most careful whine Daniel had ever heard. The child blinked once, twice, then reached out with a trembling hand. Apollo didn't move until the hand touched his fur. Then his tail wagged just once. Slow. Daniel crouched low, speaking gently. Hey there, you're safe now. We're the police. The child's lips parted, but no sound came out. They looked from Daniel to Martinez, then back to Apollo. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, they said, "There's more." Daniel felt his chest tighten. More what? The child swallowed hard. More kids. Martinez's eyes met Daniel's over the child's head. They didn't need to say it out loud. They both knew this had just become something much bigger than they'd imagined. Daniel glanced toward the darkened hallway behind them. The rest of the space suddenly felt alive with possibility. Doors they hadn't opened, corners they hadn't checked. He turned back to the child. "Can you show us?" The child hesitated, then nodded once. Daniel helped them out through the opening. Their legs were shaky, so he steadied them with one hand. Apollo stayed close, his presence oddly grounding. The child led them back into the hallway, toward another door they'd passed earlier, without thinking twice. It was unremarkable. Just another wooden slab,
paint peeling in long strips. But when Daniel pushed it open, he knew instantly this was different. The smell was stronger here. More bodies, more heat. Rows of crude wooden bunks lined the walls. Each one had a thin blanket, some in better shape than others. In the dim light, Daniel could see small shapes shifting under them. Eyes opened, dozens of them, some fearful, some curious, all too quiet for children this young. Daniel's heart pounded. He counted quickly. 7, 8, 9. He stopped at 11. 11 kids in this room alone. He forced his voice steady. It's okay. We're here to help. A few of the kids glanced at each other but didn't move. The child who had led them here stepped forward, gesturing to Apollo. It's him. He found us. Apollo padded into the room, sniffing each bed in turn. His tail wagged faintly as he checked on each child, his movements slow and deliberate. Daniel watched, a lump forming in his throat. This wasn't random. Apollo hadn't just stumbled on something. He'd known.
Martinez stepped closer to him. We've got to call this in now. Daniel nodded, but his eyes stayed on the children. Yeah, and we're not leaving until every last one is out of here. From somewhere deeper in the basement, another sound echoed, a door closing, slow and deliberate. Daniel's head snapped toward the hallway. Whoever had been keeping these kids here was still around. He turned to Martinez. Get them upstairs now. And to Apollo. With me. The shepherd's ears went up. His body shifted from gentle comfort to sharp readiness in an instant. Whatever was coming next, Apollo was ready for it. The sound of the door closing echoed through the basement like a warning bell. Daniel froze, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. Martinez caught his eye. That came from the far side, he whispered, already herding the children toward the hallway. Daniel nodded. Get them out! Don't stop until you're topside. The kids were hesitant at first, but when Martinez gestured toward the narrow stairs, they began to shuffle forward in a quiet single-file line. The older ones put their arms protectively around the younger ones. The little boy who'd led them here looked over his shoulder at Daniel, his eyes wide. Daniel gave a small nod. You're safe now. Go with him. Apollo stayed by Daniel's side, his posture stiff, ears forward. The dog's breathing was slow but controlled, a working stance Daniel recognized from his years with other canine units. He crouched beside him, murmuring, All right, partner, we're not done yet. Apollo's dark eyes never left the shadowed hallway ahead. They moved toward the sound's origin, Daniel leading with his flashlight, Apollo tracking just ahead. The corridor felt even narrower now, the air thicker. Somewhere above, faint thuds marked the kids' progress toward the surface. The hallway ended at another steel door, heavier than the others, bolted from the outside. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing the latch. It was warm, recently touched. He slid the bolt back slowly, listening. The door swung open to reveal a large, dimly lit chamber. The light came from a single bare bulb hanging crookedly from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed moments ago. The walls were lined with shelves holding boxes, cans, and what looked like plastic jugs. Apollo sniffed the air sharply, a low growl starting in his chest. Daniel swept the beam of his flashlight across the room, landing on a shadow moving near the far wall. Police! Let me see your hands! The figure froze, then bolted toward a narrow passage on the right. Daniel lunged forward, but the maze-like layout of the room slowed him. Apollo, however, was a blur, his paws hammering the concrete, nails scraping as he banked into the side corridor. Daniel followed, the beam of his flashlight jerking with each stride. The passage twisted sharply, opening into a smaller space cluttered with crates. The figure was gone. Apollo was at the far end, nose to the ground, tail rigid. He lifted his head and looked back at Daniel, then toward another opening, this one partially blocked by a stack of wooden pallets. Daniel squeezed past the pallets, stepping into a space that looked more like a crude tunnel than a room. The ceiling was lower here, the floor uneven. Fresh footprints marked the dirt, large, boot-sized, heading deeper into the dark. Apollo gave a sharp bark, the sound bouncing off the walls. Daniel clicked his radio. Martinez, suspect moving underground, possibly toward another exit. Secure the kids and get back up here now. Static crackled, followed by Martinez's tense voice. Copy that, on it. They pressed on, following the tunnel's curve. Daniel's light picked up damp spots along the walls, and a faint shimmer ahead, the reflection of water. The tunnel opened into a cavern-like space beneath the foundation. Water pooled in the center, fed by a thin trickle from a crack in the wall. The air was colder here, and every sound seemed amplified. On the far side, another opening led upward, likely to a ground-level exit. Apollo surged toward it, but Daniel caught the faintest movement in his peripheral vision, a shadow separating from the wall. Stop right there, Daniel barked. The figure froze for half a second, then turned slowly. A man, mid-40s, wiry build, clothes streaked with grime. His eyes darted between Daniel and Apollo, calculating. Hands where I can see them, Daniel ordered. Instead, the man bolted for the exit. Apollo exploded into motion, his bark echoing like thunder. In 3 strides, he launched, hitting the man square in the side, and driving him into the dirt. The impact knocked the air from the man's lungs, and Apollo clamped onto his forearm, holding but not mauling. Textbook apprehension. Daniel was on them in seconds, cuffing the man's free hand before securing the other. The suspect's face twisted in fury. You got no idea what you're doing, he spat. Daniel leaned close enough for his voice to cut through the man's. I know enough to get those kids out of here, and I know you're done. Apollo released on command but stayed poised over the man, teeth bared in silent warning. Daniel keyed his radio. Suspect in custody. We'll need someone to take him topside. 2 officers met him halfway back through the tunnel, taking the man into their custody. Daniel turned to Apollo, scratching the dog's head briefly. Nice work, partner. Real nice. But the job wasn't finished. They retraced their steps to the main basement chamber, checking every locked door, every shadow. In one room, they found shelves lined with canned food and bottled water, enough supplies to last weeks. In another, a small generator sat silent, fuel canisters stacked neatly nearby. It was becoming clear, whoever ran this operation had planned for the long haul. Daniel's radio crackled again. Rodriguez, we've got the kids outside. EMS is checking them over. Some are dehydrated, but they're all alive. Relief washed through him, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they'd found only some of the voices hinted at by the child earlier. He scanned the far corner of the basement. There, partially obscured by a fallen shelf, was another doorway. Apollo was already heading for it. The door wasn't locked, but it was jammed by debris. Daniel shoved the shelf aside, its contents spilling with a crash. Inside was a narrow staircase, steeper than the others, leading further down. The air that drifted up was warmer, almost humid. Apollo descended first, his body low and cautious. Daniel followed, flashlight steady. The stairs ended in a long rectangular room. The walls were stone, the ceiling low enough to force Daniel to hunch slightly, and along the back wall, more beds. 7 this time, 4 occupied. The children here were younger, toddlers, maybe 5 years old at most. Their eyes blinked slowly in the light, adjusting. Daniel crouched, keeping his voice gentle. It's okay. You're safe now. One little girl clutched a stuffed bear so tightly her knuckles were white. Another reached toward Apollo, her expression somewhere between fear and wonder. Apollo moved slowly to her side, lowering himself to the ground so she could touch his fur. Daniel radioed for another unit to escort the children out. He stayed until he saw each one in the arms of an officer headed upstairs. When the last child was gone, the basement felt different, emptier, but still heavy with the echoes of what had happened here. He looked at Apollo. We're not leaving until we've cleared every inch. They spent another hour, combing through the labyrinth, Behind one panel of rotting plywood, they found a stash of personal items, tiny shoes, worn jackets, school backpacks with faded cartoon characters. Each item told its own story, and none of them ended where they should have. Daniel bagged them carefully. Evidence. By the time they emerged into the cold night air, the street was lined with patrol cars, ambulances, and curious neighbors held back by yellow tape. Martinez approached, his breath visible in the frigid air. All accounted for. Daniel shook his head. Not yet, but we've got more than we started with, and we've got the guy. Apollo stood between them, scanning the crowd as if still on duty. Daniel glanced down at him. This doesn't happen without you, buddy. Apollo's tail wagged once before he turned his gaze back to the darkened building. The night wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. They were bringing light into the shadows, one step at a time. Cold night air cut against Daniel's face as he stepped out of the basement and into the flood of red and blue lights. Paramedics knelt beside bundled children on the curb, wrapping blankets around shivering shoulders, checking small hands for frostbite. Officers moved with quiet urgency, keeping the scene contained but gentle. Martinez approached, his breath puffing white in the winter air. That's 17 we've got out so far. Daniel's jaw tightened. The kid upstairs said there were more. We're still short. Apollo stood between them, scanning the crowd with alert dark eyes. His ears flicked toward the darkened building. Daniel crouched beside him. You think we missed something, partner? Apollo didn't move. Then, after a beat, he turned sharply toward the side of the building and started trotting, nose low. Daniel followed, flashlight beam cutting through the frost-furred grass. The side yard was narrower here, the ground sloping toward the rear. Half hidden behind overgrown shrubs was a section of the foundation that looked different. Newer concrete poured against old stone. Apollo sniffed along the seam, then sat, glancing back at Daniel. Daniel stepped closer, running his gloved hand over the surface. Martinez, he called quietly. His partner joined him, crouching low. That's not original. No, Daniel agreed. And it's hollow. He rapped his knuckles against the slab. The sound was dull, but there was an echo beneath it, like knocking on the lid of a crate. They moved quickly. 2 more officers joined them with pry bars and a sledgehammer. The first swing rang out like a gunshot in the cold night. Concrete cracked, dust spilling into the air. Apollo backed up, ears pinned against the sound, but never took his eyes off the spot. After 10 minutes of pounding and chiseling, the slab gave way, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it. A rush of warm, stale air poured out. Daniel dropped to his hands and knees, shining his flashlight inside. The beam cut across a dirt floor, wooden support beams, and farther back, what looked like another doorway. I'm going in, he said. Martinez frowned. You sure? That thing's barely wide enough for you. Then it's perfect for kids, Daniel replied. He slid inside, feeling the cold earth under his palms, the ceiling pressing low enough to force a crawl. Apollo followed close behind, his body low, but his movement confident. The crawl space ended at a short set of wooden steps, leading up to a plain plywood door. It wasn't locked, just wedged shut with a metal rod. Daniel worked it loose, the scrape of metal against wood loud in the silence. He pushed the door open slowly. The beam of his flashlight swept over the room beyond and stopped. It was larger than he expected. The walls were made of rough planks, and the ceiling sloped low, but it had been lived in. Along one wall sat 6 small beds, each with a thin blanket. In the far corner, a stack of cardboard boxes served as makeshift shelves for clothes and shoes. And in the center of the room, a group of children sat in a tight circle, their faces pale in the light. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest maybe 3. Daniel knelt, lowering the light so it wasn't in their eyes. Hey, he said softly. My name's Daniel. We're here to get you out.
For a moment no one moved. Then a boy with dark hair and weary eyes spoke. "Where's the man?" "He's not coming back," Daniel said. "You're safe now." Apollo stepped forward, tail wagging low, and sniffed gently at the nearest child. The tension in the room shifted just slightly. One little girl reached out, brushing her fingers over his fur. Daniel keyed his radio. "We've got 6 more. Need blankets and EMS down here now." Martina's voice crackled back. "Copy. On the way." He stayed with them until 2 paramedics arrived, passing the kids one by one through the narrow opening. The last child, a boy clutching a battered baseball cap, paused, looking back into the room. "What is it?" Daniel asked. The boy hesitated. "There's another place." Daniel's pulse kicked up. "Where?" The boy pointed to the far wall behind the boxes. He crossed the room in 3 strides, moving the boxes aside to reveal a section of plywood paneling. It was hinged with a small latch near the floor. Apollo sniffed at it once, then gave a sharp bark. Daniel opened the latch and swung the panel wide. A narrow passage sloped downward, the air growing warmer and more humid the farther it went. They moved quickly, Daniel's flashlight bouncing over packed earth walls. The passage turned twice before opening into a chamber that stopped him in his tracks. It was the largest room yet, and it was full. 9 more children sat along the walls, wrapped in blankets and holding cups of water. An officer knelt among them, speaking softly. Martinez looked up as Daniel entered. "Found them hiding. They were too scared to come out until we got the first group topside." Daniel counted quickly. "That's all of them?" Martinez nodded. 23 in total. Daniel exhaled slowly. The weight of the night pressed down on him. Relief tangled with cold fury at what these kids had endured. He glanced at Apollo, who was moving from child to child, sniffing gently, his tail swaying in that slow, careful way of a dog who knows the moment calls for gentleness. One little boy wrapped his arms around Apollo's neck and didn't let go. It took nearly an hour to get everyone topside. Paramedics worked in a steady rhythm, checking vitals, handing out warm drinks, and tucking blankets tighter around small shoulders. Neighbors watched from behind the police tape, their faces pale in the wash of emergency lights. Daniel stood at the edge of the scene, scanning it all. The children safe in the backs of ambulances, the suspect being loaded into a squad car, Martinez giving a statement to a local reporter. Apollo stood beside him, finally sitting for the first time in hours. "You did good tonight," Daniel said quietly, scratching behind his ears. Apollo leaned into the touch, then turned his gaze toward the dark shape of the building. Daniel followed his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly, "that place won't hold anyone ever again." When the last ambulance pulled away, the scene began to quiet. Officers packed up gear, crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, and the cold crept back into Daniel's bones. Martinez walked over, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "We got them all. 23, not a single one unaccounted for." Daniel nodded. "That's the number I wanted to hear." As they headed toward the cruiser, Apollo trotted a few steps ahead. His ears relaxed now, his tail swinging with a tired rhythm. Daniel knew he'd remember this night for the rest of his career. Not for the arrest, not for the paperwork that would drown them in the morning, but for the sight of Apollo guiding them step by step toward every locked door, every hidden passage, until not a single child was left in the dark. 3 days after the rescue, Riverside Falls was still buzzing. You couldn't walk into the cafe without overhearing pieces of the story. How the police found them, how many kids there were, the stranger who'd been keeping them hidden right under everyone's nose. But for Daniel Rodriguez, the noise wasn't what stayed with him. It was the silence. Those moments in the basement where the air was thick and still, where the kids' wide eyes said everything their voices couldn't. He sat at his kitchen table now, coffee cooling in front of him, the early morning light slanting across the floor. Apollo lay stretched out at his feet, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The retriever hadn't left his side since that night. The front door rattled with a knock. Daniel pushed back his chair and opened it to find Martinez, hands full, 2 paper cups of coffee in one hand, a folded newspaper under his arm. Figured you could use the caffeine, Martinez said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Daniel smirked. You're not wrong. Martinez dropped the paper on the table. The front page was a full-color photo of Apollo sitting on the sidewalk that night, a blanket draped around his shoulders, 2 kids leaning into him. The headline read, "Hero K9 helps save 23." Daniel stared at it for a long moment. That's going to be the picture people remember. They should, Martinez said, settling into a chair. He earned it. Apollo lifted his head at the sound of his name, then went back to resting. The day unfolded slowly. Reporters called. A TV crew wanted an interview. Daniel turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in turning the case into a media circus. The kids needed privacy, not flashbulbs. Still, there were meetings. The mayor wanted to present commendations. The school board sent a thank you letter. A church group organized a clothing drive. Everywhere he went, people stopped him to ask about Apollo. By late afternoon, he'd finally made it to the station. The lobby was busier than usual. Donors dropping off toys, blankets, gift cards. Daniel saw the front desk officer stacking boxes into neat piles. In the corner, one of the rescued kids sat with a social worker, coloring quietly. The little boy who'd first told Daniel there were more kids looked up, spotted Apollo, and broke into a grin. "Apollo," he called. The dog trotted over, tail wagging, and sat in front of the boy. The child wrapped both arms around his neck, holding on for a few seconds before pulling back. "You doing okay?" Daniel asked. The boy nodded. "They gave me new shoes." He stuck out a sneakered foot like proof. "That's good," Daniel said. "You deserve them." The boy leaned close, his voice dropping. "I wasn't scared when you came." "Why's that?" "'Cause Apollo was there." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too, kiddo." Later that evening, Daniel drove home along the winding back road that cut through the edge of town. The air smelled of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of fallen leaves. Apollo sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The retriever seemed lighter now, the tension gone from his posture. Daniel thought about the moment he'd first seen him sitting in the rain outside that old building. How easily it could have been missed. When they pulled into the driveway, the sky was deep blue, the first stars just appearing. Daniel let Apollo out and watched him trot to the porch, pausing to sniff the air like he was cataloging the whole neighborhood. Inside, Daniel filled Apollo's bowl, then poured himself another cup of coffee. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out toward the dark tree line. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The following Saturday, the town held a small gathering at the community center. It wasn't fancy. No reporters, no speeches longer than a few minutes. Just neighbors, the rescued children with their temporary guardians, and the officers who'd been there that night. Daniel kept to the back, a paper plate of barbecue in one hand, a cup of lemonade in the other. Apollo stayed close, accepting the occasional scratch behind the ears from passing kids. When the mayor took the mic, she didn't talk about the arrest or the investigation. She talked about vigilance, about neighbors watching out for one another, about the strange way a dog's persistence had broken open something that might have stayed hidden forever. And she finished talking about how sometimes heroes come on 4 legs. The applause was warm, genuine. Apollo perked up at the sound, glancing at Daniel, as if to check whether he'd done something new to deserve it. Daniel crouched beside him. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured. "They're clapping for you." Afterward, as people drifted out, One of the older girls who'd been rescued approached Daniel. She held a folded piece of paper. "It's for Apollo," she said. Daniel unfolded it. Inside was a crayon drawing. Apollo in the middle, surrounded by stick figure children holding hands. Above them in wobbly letters were the words, "Thank you for finding us." Daniel swallowed hard. "He's going to keep this forever," he said. The girl smiled shyly, then hugged Apollo before heading off. That night, back home, Daniel pinned the drawing to the wall above his desk. Beside it, he taped the newspaper photo from Martinez. 2 reminders. One for the public story, one for the personal one. He sat down, Apollo curling at his feet. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. Daniel knew there would be reports to finish, hearings to attend, maybe even a trial where he'd have to testify. But those were just the aftershocks. The real work had been done in the dark, with a flashlight in one hand, and a dog leading the way. Before bed he stepped out onto the porch. The night air was sharp, the sky wide and full of stars. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's porch light flicked on. Apollo came to sit beside him, leaning against his leg. Daniel scratched his neck. "You know, buddy, not every case ends like this, but I'm glad this one did." Apollo tilted his head as if he understood every word. Daniel smiled. "Come on, let's go inside. We've got a quiet night ahead." The porch light clicked off as they stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them. The old building at the edge of town was boarded up now, a crime scene until the lawyers and the courts were done. But in the small warm kitchen of Daniel's home, with Apollo stretched out on the rug, the only thing that mattered was that the dark had been broken, once and for all. Winter in Riverside Falls had a way of slowing everything down. Snow softened the streets, the cafe kept the coffee hot, and the town seemed to breathe a little easier, now that the nightmare was over. For Daniel Rodriguez, the days since the rescue had been a mix of paperwork, court prep and quiet moments that caught him off guard. A child's drawing left in his mailbox, a thank you note from a family he'd never met, a stranger picking up his coffee tab with nothing more than a nod. And always there was Apollo. The retriever had become a local celebrity, though he didn't seem to notice. When they walked through town, people stopped to greet him, kids ran up to hug him, and shopkeepers slipped him treats under the counter. Daniel noticed something else too. Apollo had stopped scanning the shadows. No more tense posture, no more fixed stares at the edges of the yard. He seemed lighter, his work done. But every now and then, if they passed the old Patterson building, now boarded up and waiting for demolition, Apollo's ears would prick, and he'd glance at it for just a second before moving on. One afternoon, about a month after the rescue, Daniel got a call from the social worker handling the children's cases. "They're all placed now," she said, "some with relatives, some with foster families. Every one of them is in a safe home." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. "That's good to hear. They still talk about him, you know," she added. "The dog. They ask about him all the time." Daniel smiled. "Tell them he's doing just fine." The next Saturday, he and Apollo drove out to the community center. A few of the kids were there for an art activity, and when they saw Apollo, the room lit up. One by one they came over, some shy, some bold, to pet him, to bury their faces in his fur. Apollo handled it all with quiet patience, tail wagging in a slow, steady rhythm. The little boy who'd first whispered, "There's more," climbed into Daniel's lap and stayed there until his foster mom came to collect him. That night, Daniel sat at his desk, looking at the newspaper photo and the crayon drawing pinned side by side on the wall. He thought about how close it had come to being just another unsolved mystery, another dark story that never made it to the light. And he thought about how it had started, with a retriever sitting in the rain, refusing to look away. As winter edged toward spring, the trial began. The man arrested that night was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and abuse. The courtroom was tense, but the evidence was overwhelming. Daniel testified. So did Martinez. So did several of the older children, their voices steady as they told the jury about the locked rooms, the hidden passages, the long days without seeing the sun. Apollo, of course, didn't testify, but his role was clear in every account. When the guilty verdict came in, it was like a weight lifting off the whole town. That evening, Daniel drove out to a quiet overlook above Riverside Falls. The valley spread below, the lights of the town glowing warm in the dusk. Apollo sat beside him, their breath mingling in the cool air. "You did it, buddy," Daniel said quietly. "We both did." Apollo turned his head, dark eyes meeting his, for a moment before returning to the view. By summer the old Patterson building was gone, demolished and cleared to bare earth. The town voted to turn the lot into a small park with a plaque, honoring the courage of the children rescued here, and the canine whose loyalty would not let them be forgotten. The day they unveiled it, the kids who could come stood together in the sunshine, some holding hands, some holding on to Apollo. Daniel kept to the edge of the crowd, but when the mayor finished her speech, she waved him forward. "This town owes a debt," she said, to Officer Daniel Rodriguez, and to Apollo. The applause was warm, but Daniel's eyes were on the children, and on Apollo, sitting calmly in the grass, tail thumping against the ground. Life settled after that. Daniel went back to his regular cases, traffic stops, neighbor disputes, the usual small-town rhythms, but nothing felt quite the same. Some nights, sitting on the porch with Apollo at his feet, he'd think about the echo of those basement hallways, the quiet courage of the kids, the way Apollo had moved without hesitation toward every locked door. And he'd think about how, in the end, it hadn't been some big flashy lead or a lucky break. It had been persistence, a dog who wouldn't give up. One evening in late August, he took Apollo for a walk through the new park. The grass was still growing in, and the plaque stood under a young maple tree. Daniel stopped to read it again, the words etched into bronze. He glanced down at Apollo. "Not bad for a guy who works for Kibble," he said with a smile. Apollo tilted his head, then gave a quiet huff, as if to say he had no idea what the fuss was about. As the sun dipped below the hills, Daniel knew the story would live on. Not just in the plaque, not just in the newspaper archives, but in the way the town carried itself now. More watchful, more willing to step in. And maybe that was the real victory. From that first rainy afternoon to the final rescue, the thread had been simple: a man and a dog, following an instinct, until it led them somewhere no one else had thought to look. And because of that, 23 children got to see the sky again. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Now I'd like to hear from you. If you had been the one to see Apollo sitting outside that building, staring at the door, would you have stopped, or would you have driven on?